Oops, we left the title screen up there. Hang on a moment, folks. We're hiding behind
There
the
we,
billboard. Right, there we go. There we
there
go.
we
Always a
are.
few,
We are now official.
few technical glitches every week. That's what makes it fun. So,
That's right.
well, welcome back to Mondays, ladies and gentlemen. Looks like we have a few folks in here already this evening. Hopefully you pick up a few stragglers before the night is out. And welcome to yet another edition of Monday Night Monsters.
That's right. I think
How's
that
it going, Ron?
these people like monsters and they like cinema. And tonight we're just going to kind of wreck them together and see what happens.
Now, hi, I'm not sure if that's Lala or Layla, but hello, welcome aboard. Nice to have you on the show tonight. So
She's
yeah, tonight
actually
we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We thought that the last 10 episodes. Can you believe we've actually completed 10 episodes now? The last 10 episodes, we've kind of leaned heavily into sort of history and academia a little bit with this, and we thought that it would be fun this week to do something a little bit different because I know certainly I got into monsters because of monster movies, and I think probably Ron, to some degree, you certainly did as well, right?
absolutely. That's right.
You
That's
know,
right. That was a great bonding time with my mom. We would stay up late on Saturdays watching what monster movies were on. It was a great time to be a kid.
It really was. And that was back in the days when broadcast television had all these black and white and grainy old monster movies. You could barely see anything on the screen, which made it all the more scary. And so I had up here in New England, we had a show called Creature Double Feature, which the music, when I hear it today, still gives me shivers because I loved it so much. And so we thought, a really fun thing to do for tonight was to sort of go back and meet some of the monsters in their cinematic incarnations. And so Ron and I have each picked. Hi, Mary Beth, and I saw that Pepper was in here as well. Welcome aboard, guys. We thought we would each pick our 10 favorite movies from the early years of horror cinema. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through a countdown, matching up our 10 choices from 10 to 1, see if we have any, matchups in there. And then we'll kind of talk a little bit about why these movies inspired us. So we thought that might be a fun idea.
It's kind of like a very haunted Siskel and Ebert.
Exactly. Even psychotic, one might say.
That's right. That's right.
Cyberjack, hello, welcome aboard. I'm sure a lot of folks out in the audience are big horror movie fans. It's hard not to love monsters and not love all the wonderful movies that have been made over the years. And of course, we're now well into over a century into the era of horror. And so that's what we're going to be exploring tonight, is that first sort of big boom of horror that came about in the early 20th century.
Right. And
I feel
whenever I was compiling the list, I was surprised at how many of the movies that were on my list were already over a century old.
I know, it's incredible when you really think about it that way, isn't it? I mean, we're already in 2022. It's hard to imagine that cinema or that movies had already been around for close to 30 years at that point. Not, the way they are today, obviously, but that people had been going to see films for close to 30 years by that time. It's extraordinary to imagine. Mm-hmm. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be looking at basically monsters on film, and for this is going to be our first installment. We're not necessarily going to do it week to week, so we're not going to basically have the next 6 weeks being this kind of thing, but over the course of the coming summer and maybe into the fall, we're going to do different chapters, and we're going to cover different eras of monsters in the cinema, and I think a lot of that will end up being a nice overlap for the things we've already done, because just about every one of the creatures we've talked about in the last couple of months have been represented in some way in horror cinema.
Right. And one of my favorite shows that we had on was the zombie episode. And we focused so much on how the zombie hype really affected our culture, and how our culture is reflected in that. And I think that these movies is going to prove out the same way, that this is a projection of ourselves onto the celluloid. And even though it's called science fiction or horror, there's very much of a humanity behind it all as well.
There is, and our monsters are always in some way a reflection of who we are. It's a warped mirror version of ourselves, and so we really look at these monsters, both the heroes and the villains in these movies, and we see the two sides sort of the human condition. Right. So there is a lot of sociology, there's a lot of psychology and culture that's reflected in all of these.
Right. But
So,
you can
Mary,
imagine
your monster appreciation came mainly from books, which of course is the primary source for so many of these stories. Not every one of them. Obviously, some monsters don't really have a particular literary connection. But if you started with books, more power to you, because that really is where the wealth of this came from, and that's where we all got our start. I think.
right.
Well, I like to think.
Yeah, absolutely. The one thing that I do have to say about movies, though, is it kind of throws it out there, so we are not conjuring images in our mind the way literature works. This is something that's directly, on our in our imaginations right there. So we're following somebody else's guidance at this point, the director's guidance or whatever. So I think whenever we start looking at these movies, and I'm excited to jump in here, you will see how incredibly, even though that they're old, how incredibly modern they seem too in their sensibilities.
In many ways, definitely. So what I wanted to start with is the fact that we were just talking about the fact that we're well over a century into the age of cinema now. Some of the earliest examples of those would be, believe, the first horror film ever made. One of the earliest films ever available to the public was a horror film called House of the Devil, made in 1896. Like most of the movies back then, it's not a 2-hour film. It's a very short subject, and mostly it's an exercise in visual trickery. They were playing with the idea of stop motion and popping things in and out of the camera. You can find House of the Devil on YouTube, and I highly recommend that you go look for it, because it's a silly, cute little thing. This this sort of hapless very Elizabethan looking character walks into an old house, and bats and wizards and skeletons and all sorts of things pop up, and it's pretty cute. But it really is kind of the first example of a horror movie, and to think that was 1896 is pretty remarkable. And then you have Edison's Frankenstein, which was made in 1910. I believe is the first adaptation of Frankenstein ever put to film. Once again, a fairly short film, but the figure of Frankenstein in it, or the Frankenstein monster, which we can see here, is a fairly grotesque creature, and it was, from a makeup perspective, actually a pretty impressive production. So these are some really early examples. But I think that what we're going to be focusing on tonight, Ron's and my top 10 list, is the movies that, rather than simply being oddities or curiosities, as these films were in their day, the iconic films that defined a generation. And so we're going to stick with mostly these.
And I will tell you that the Edison film almost made my list, because it really was the introduction to the idea of electricity and what could be spawned through this kind of new type of energy that mankind has had recently harnessed. It almost made my list, but I think that when we start breaking these movies down, we'll see that this is just in the periphery compared to some of these other movies.
Yeah, and actually, I'm exactly in the same place. I thought about putting in the list, but it seemed a little bit too early on, and not necessarily one that had a huge impact. It had a huge impact in its own way, but didn't really impact the culture of horror that would go forward. And so again, it kind of stayed on the sidelines of that. But I couldn't go without mentioning it. I felt like we certainly had to give it its due here. We talked about it a little bit as well back when we did our Frankenstein episode several weeks ago. And before we get underway too far, one thing I want to say first of all is, I know we've always got some nice folks here from Dark Zone Radio. We're always happy to have you folks aboard. Welcome. We've got our viewers here on YouTube, our viewers through Dead Air Full Spectrum. All the folks aboard here, we're absolutely thrilled to have you here. And if you enjoy our show tonight, don't forget, hit that subscribe button. Dead Air Full Spectrum has a lot of awesome programming, including Monday Night Monsters, which we do here every week. And there's a lot of fun stuff that you can tune into. And also give us a like, hit that thumbs up button, because that always helps us a great deal.
Absolutely. No.
So without further ado, I would like to introduce us to number 10 in Ron and my top 10 horror films of the early years of cinema. So, Ron, why don't you start us off and talk a little bit about your film here?
Absolutely. So the Golem, based upon Jewish folklore, where a creature is created out of clay. Some magical words is written, and these words are then placed within the creature's mouth, and the creature comes alive to do the person's bidding. We talked about the Golem whenever we talked about Frankenstein. The movie, The Golem, was set in the Middle Ages, and it dealt with the persecution of the Jews at that time. The reason why I put this on my list is because this is a visionary film. This is one of those films that was uncannily predictive of what was going to happen, because within 10 years, what was happening in the movie The Golem would now be happening in Europe under the Nazi movement. That is really the reason why I put that in here. This is a social commentary. The movie is frightening. I remember, seeing it for the first time whenever I was a kid, and running and hiding because the golem was just so frightening. But like Frankenstein, it was set out to be something that was very beneficial to humanity, and all things break down. And as typical of mankind, that invention, which was meant to serve people, turned on the very people that it was meant to serve. So I think this is one of those hallmarks in very early film that was making a political statement and really had its finger on the pulse of the world, what was going on. And instead of coming out and being abundantly clear about some of the worries that was spreading across Europe, they put the setting in the 1500s. But again, a remarkably scary flick.
And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's set in Prague. Is that not
It
correct?
is. That is
Yeah.
correct. Yes. Yeah.
Now, I have to say, I was talking about this with you before before we actually went live. Is I have not had the pleasure of seeing this film. Some of these old silent films, I have not ever actually gotten through the whole thing. I have a terrible tendency with silent films to nod off. It's just an ADD thing, I think. One of these days, I'll probably put on a nice soundtrack and get myself through that. There's not too many of the silent ones I've made it through.
I think that is a very interesting thing to bring up as well, because from our sensibilities, it is difficult to get through a silent film. And the reason why these films have made our list is because they kind of interact with us in ways that the other ones simply do not.
So my first film on the list, my number 10 here, is a film that is called London After Midnight. And this is an interesting film to make it onto the list at all, because as I'm sure you must be aware, Ron, this film is a lost movie. There is no complete print of London After Midnight that still exists. The only prints that exist of it are reconstructed prints using the original script and using stills. So not only a silent film, but a still film. It's like a slideshow, which is kind of remarkable when you think about that. So I have never, like most people, have never actually seen this film in its entirety. I can tell you that Turner Classic Movies many years ago put together this sort of film strip version that told the entire story. And it is it's an interesting story because it's a horror film, it's a mystery, it's a murder story, but it's also kind of a MacGuffin, in that this is a story about a murder which is supposedly committed by a vampire. And I'm going to ask you to forgive me right now. I'm going to drop spoilers on this well over a century old movie and tell you that there's no actual vampire in the movie. It all turns out to be an elaborate ruse to catch the real killer. But this is one of Lon Chaney, the original Lon Chaney, not Lon Chaney Jr., Lon Chaney, the man of 1,000 faces, one of his remarkable roles, in which he, as always, developed this extraordinary physical makeup for it. He used wire rings to hold his eyes open. He put in these handmade fangs into his mouth and had this terrible rictus grin. And his image in the movie is so potent and so frightening that I've always, ever since I was a kid, found it to be an incredibly terrifying image. He's such a monstrous looking creature. And having seen the Turner reconstruction of it, I've always been fascinated by this story. So it's again, it's a little bit of an odd one to be on here because it's not just silent. It's a film that, realistically speaking, I don't think any print still exists to this day, but I think it deserves, and it's as such an icon of horror. And I think there's no horror fan who's not familiar with Lon Chaney's appearance in this film, that certainly deserved its top place in this list. I am going to point out that that I nearly put the remake of London After Midnight, which is called Mark of the Vampire, which was made a few years after Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi as the vampire in the film. Much more elaborate. It's even directed by Todd Browning, the man who directed the original Universal Dracula film. I almost put that on the list, but it got bumped at the last minute for some of the other films out there. But maybe someday, if we're really lucky, London After Midnight, some lost copy will suddenly turn up in somebody's vault, and that would be a little bit of a miracle, I would say.
But I think that if you're going to start out on a retrospect of how important Lon Chaney was to cinema, You have to start out with this movie because, as you said, bare minimum with makeup. This was somebody acting, and becoming that creature. Unlike with his Phantom of the Opera, or unlike with his Quasimodo, this was basically just him out there doing his thing.
And he was an extraordinary, he was what we would call today a method actor.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean, he physically transformed himself. He went through such incredible pain sometimes to wear the makeups in these films. When he played Quasimodo in Hunchback of Notre Dame, he had a hump on his back which weighed like 30 pounds, and it forced him to walk hunched over. The makeup, as I say, often twisted his mouth, twisted his eyes, and he ended up in great physical pain, which he endured for the purpose of looking so monstrous and so extraordinary in these roles, which is how he earned the name A Man of a Thousand Faces. And it's funny, something that will come back a little bit, later in the program tonight. Of course, his son Lon Chaney Jr. went on to a fairly distinguished film career as well, but was saddled with the unfortunate nickname "The Man of One Face" because
yeah,
his single defining role throughout his
yeah.
career. So a little
That's
bit of
right.
a little bit of a step down from his dad.
Yeah. Yes, but somebody has mentioned about the Ozzy Osbourne reference to London After Midnight. I will tell you that I definitely see that resemblance. You see the resemblance not only to Ozzy Osbourne, but if you think about the film later, the Clockwork Orange, that
Mhm.
whole Victorian type of menacing habit, so to speak. I do think this is reoccurring, and it's done very deliberately as well.
He was, again, such an iconic
Yep.
figure that despite the fact that really there's not probably many people alive who have actually seen London After Midnight because it's been gone for so long. The last copy, they say, was destroyed, I think, in the 1940s or 1950s in a fire. That despite the fact that so few people have seen it, the image just
The
remains
image. That's
iconic
right.
today.
That's right. That's
So
right.
so on to number 9. So at number 9 on our list of top 10 films from the early era, we have Haksan, which was made in 1922, and The Lodger, made in 1944. That one being a remake as well. So I'm going to start out, if you don't mind, Ron, with this one because this is a little bit of this was an interesting one to put on the list as well. I'm often heard to say that I'm not a big fan of mysteries. I'm not a big fan of murder stories. I don't watch cop dramas or things like that. And when I'm describing a film as horror, generally I'm looking for a film that has supernatural elements, monsters, things like that. The Lodger, however, does not, because this is a story about Jack the Ripper. And it is actually based on a 1911 novel called The Lodger by a woman named Marie Belloc Lowndes. And the original novel, which she printed in 1911, does not call its killer Jack the Ripper. It changes the story, but it is clearly and very distinctly, and she certainly, admitted this, based on the story of Jack the Ripper. It was made into a film in, I think, 1927, also called The Lodger, one of Alfred Hitchcock's first films. He stayed very close to Marie Belloc Lowndes' book, and so he also does not actually call the killer Jack the Ripper. But in 1944, this version with Merle Oberon and Laird Krieger just gave the story its original name back, and or rather its original identity back, and called the killer Jack the Ripper, as he was always meant to be. It's an incredibly atmospheric film. It's like most films of its time. It's a little bit stilted if you watch it today, but it still has incredible atmosphere, beautiful production values for film made at that time. The foggy streets of London, the sets in this film are magnificent. The camera often follows characters down streets and around corners in a way that makes it feel as if it was filmed in Victorian London, but it was all done on sound stages, and I've always found it a remarkable film. And I've always found Jack the Ripper to be one of the most famous characters in history. And the reason I felt that I could include it in today's list is because, unlike most killers, serial killer movies and things like this, Jack the Ripper has truly become a monster in our cultural our cultural consciousness. Jack the Ripper is a distinctly spooky character. He's always portrayed in this extremely, the dark cloak and the dark hat with this flashing knife in the dark, and he's like Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees or Michael Myers, these killers who are no longer killers, they're iconic monsters. And I think Jack the Ripper is really the first great serial killer monster in our culture. So I felt like this one was deserving of a place on the list.
Yeah, as my
Having
camera
having some
have
technical difficulties.
a mind of itself, I was actually going to include this film on my list as well too, because it is such an iconic film. And the idea of Jack the Ripper, absolutely, he's taken on an aura all of his own. He is at once human and at once boogeyman at the same time. So absolutely, this works out well. So my choice of film is Haxan, which is, you talked about falling asleep during a movie. I've never made it through this movie without falling asleep at least once. It's incredibly long. I think it's something like 3 hours long. It opens up with basically a scholarly lecture on witchcraft that goes on far, far too long. And then it traces witchcraft through the ages. We see it in the Middle Ages, the Malleus Maleficarum, through the Renaissance. It is hard to get through. It is extremely violent for being made in 1922. This is one of those rare movies that actually has sexuality involved in it as well too. But whenever you get to the interaction between the witches and Satan itself, it is as if you are in the room with them, as if as you said with the lodger. It's the way the camera work. It's almost as if you're a voyeur into that time and place. It's very unsettling, and the special effects are absolutely amazing whenever it comes down to the demonic forces that are at work.
Visuals in the film are stunning, honestly,
Yeah.
especially for 1922, I think it
22,
was made.
22,
And
yeah.
it's a Swedish film, is that correct? I
It
think it's
is. It
Swedish.
is. Yeah.
And that may explain why they got away with some of the more intense, some of the more intense visuals in the film, because obviously from country to country, the different sort of social restrictions on that kind of thing were a little bit different. And so I think that the Scandinavian countries have always been a little bit more permissive, and it
Yeah.
leads it to having some incredibly intense scenes, and again, makeup that never ceases to astound me. And again, special effects are remarkable in this
That's right.
film.
And the other thing is that this movie is not a condemnation of witchcraft in any way. It is basically simply an overview of witchcraft through the ages. So there's not actually, if you watch the film, it seems that society at large is the antagonist, and it is the witches themselves who are kind of on the periphery of humanity, who are suffering everything that humanity kind of projects upon them.
So again, a fairly liberal perspective on that, which would not be unusual in a Scandinavian country, where again, attitudes and public mores were different than they were in maybe some of the more repressive areas of Europe, especially in the early part of the 20th century. So again, its cultural impact, I think, was pretty significant at the time. It was incredibly scandalous, and to this day, you're right. It's not just hard to watch because it's long, but also because some of the imagery in the film is deeply disturbing, but so beautifully done. So let's check out where we are for number 8 on our list. So at number 8, we have, Ron, you've got Phantom of the Opera.
I do have Phantom of the Opera
I
on
knew
there.
we would find our way back to Lon Chaney.
Absolutely. Now, the reason why I did Phantom of the Opera, guys, and I'll tell you, this might seem a little cliche, is because without this movie and without the way Lon Chaney represents the Phantom, you would never have Andrew Lloyd Webber's Phantom of the Opera. And that's really one of the reasons why I put it on here, is because although this was made in 1925, it is going to shape popular culture 60 years later in a way like no other film has. It is, of course, silent, so we don't have the music. There's no Phantom of the Opera or any of this kind of songs that's going on here. It's played very much through the facial expressions of Lon Chaney, and it is terrifying whenever that moment comes and he is revealed for the first time to the audience. And you also see it in the play as well too, almost scene for scene in that unveiling of the Phantom. That is a really a frightening moment. Now, getting back to the idea of the lodger, again, this Phantom character is, for all sense and purposes, a human being, right? He has been scarred by humanity, but he's still essentially a human being that's exacting his revenge, or he's projecting himself onto to the world around him. Let's put it that way. So not a typical monster in any respects, but it's that human being that's capable of becoming a monster if left untethered.
Yeah. So Ken's chiming in from the background here, pointing out that that in the theater, some people actually fainted when they saw his face revealed. And this is an interesting bit of trivia, because today it's hard for us to watch some of these old films and find them frightening. You know, we call them horror films, but by our standards, we're so inured to these kind of images that just a monstrous face or an ugly face no longer really does it for us. We need to see horrors, true horrors on screen to find anything terrifying. We're very jaded. But back then, these kind of images, people had seen illustrations in books. If they had picked up a copy of the actual Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux, they might have seen an image on the cover. But even then, they were generally pretty tame. And so the idea of seeing a moving image of somebody with such a hideous countenance was truly shocking, because visual makeup like that was something that was comparatively new, in the cinema. And to see these creatures brought to life was deeply, deeply shocking for people. I've always thought that, in addition to his London After Midnight makeup, that the makeup that Chaney wears in this film is probably one of the most hideous he ever did. He truly looks like a living corpse. And I will say this, although I've always enjoyed the show Phantom of the Opera, and I'm not ashamed to admit I've belted out, music of the night in my shower many, many times, that the makeup on the Phantom in the Broadway production is tame as all hell. Nothing compared to the way Eric the Phantom here looks in the original 1925 film. That's not the very first version of it put to film, but probably one of the most extraordinary. My choice for this one, and we have, you and I, it seems, I think we have very, very different palettes on these kind of thing, and I think you lean towards some of the more artistic films. I have to admit, I'm a cheesy Halloween monster movie lover, and so I do tend to adore the old Universal classic monsters. And House of Frankenstein had to make it on the list for me, because this is a movie. It was the first movie where they brought all of their most famous monsters together under one title. And so House of Frankenstein has Dracula, it has the Frankenstein monster, it has the Wolfman, it has a mad scientist. In this case, curiously enough, the monster is played by actor Glenn Strange. It's his first turn in the role. And the mad scientist is played by Boris Karloff, who had made his career playing the Frankenstein monster. Glenn Strange would go on to play the monster, the creature, in many successive films. And in a lot of ways, I've always thought of Glenn Strange as my Frankenstein, because he was so tall, so imposing in the makeup. He may not be any Boris Karloff, but he was the lumbering, monstrous Frankenstein monster that truly terrified me as a child. And so this is his first turn in the film. And you have this great, bizarre mashup story where by a whole variety of coincidences, all the monsters end up basically under the same roof. Although interestingly enough, and I think this is kind of a funny nod to the fact that Universal was running out of ideas at this time, the stories between the Dracula chapter of the movie and the Frankenstein chapter of the movie don't actually end up meshing up. They kill off Dracula before the Frankenstein monster is ever even discovered, and that was a little bit of, I think, a miscalculation on their part. But the idea of seeing all these monsters still together under, in one film for the first time, it made my little young heart thump a thump, and I was so delighted by it. So this one will always have a very special place for me.
It did, and I will tell you this too. This was also made right at the end of World War II. So when we think about all the human atrocities that were going on, this was a way of escapism on a degree which has never been seen before. Right? We have all these famous monsters one setting, and we can kind of take our mind off of the world at large, and then again have monsters be monsters, and we're just kind of in the background watching it. But I think there's a commentary to be said about that as well too. Whenever we look at the dates on these various projects.
It really was. It was pure escapism, and that was what the world needed at that time. And I think
Exactly.
that's one of the things that the Universal monsters really represented. Plus, it was almost always, even though the time frame that the classic Universal films were set in this time
Mm.
didn't really have a fixed period in time. It was sort of somewhere between Victorian and Edwardian and modern times. Sometimes
Right.
you saw cars, sometimes you saw carts and horses and everything. So it was this timeless, very old fashioned feeling, and I think that was comforting to people as well. So
And
it's strange to think that the monsters were more comforting than the idea of Nazis and bombs at that point.
absolutely. Do you think that that was done intentionally? That's a great point. I've never heard of that before because you really don't know whenever these things are set. Do you
There's
think that
never
was?
any fixed date on anything. Again, it
Yeah,
has this timeless. If you're in America, there's always going to be always going to be cars and neon lights. But if they're in Transylvania, you're never going to see a piece of machinery of any kind unless it's Frankenstein's lab, sort of thing. So it
right.
does kind of give this idea that time is fluid and sort of unfixed in these films.
Yeah. See, this is the reason why I'd like to have a radio show with you. I've never thought about that before.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I've always loved about it because
Yeah.
I'm a kind of an antiquarian myself, and I have to tell you, the very first time I traveled to Europe, I got off the plane fully expecting it to be like gypsies with violins on the street corners and hay carts everywhere because that's what I'd grown used to seeing in movies. I'm kind of not a very smart American to think that way, but
That's
that's
right. That's
that's
right.
what
That's
I'd
right.
grown up expecting.
Yeah. Yeah. The first time I went to England, the first few days I was there, I was making my living as a pickpocket until I figured out you can't do that anymore.
I'm going to call you Dodger from now
That's
on.
right. That's right. I was living with some old guy down by the Thames. I thought this was completely normal.
So let's jump into number 7 and see where we are here. So at number 7. Now you went for sci-fi this time around, so
I
so I'm going to start out. I'm going to give us a little jump start here into a classic ghost story that I fell in love with quite a few years ago. I actually saw The Uninvited, made also in 1944, where again that era right towards the end of the war when people were heart of the war, really people needed escapism. But at that period in cinematic history, most ghost stories turned out to be MacGuffins. Most of them turned out to be a hoax. It turned out to be basically they were making Scooby-Doo movies back then, where the ghost was almost always some kind of a scheme to scare somebody away from an important treasure or something like that. But The Uninvited definitely changed the script on that, and they came up with a really truly classic modern ghost story. The film is set in the current day, which of course at that point would be the 1940s, about a young man who is a writer and his sister who buy a little house in Cornwall and want to move into it. They've been traveling all over England and they find this house. They think it's delightful and they end up getting it for a song. But the former owner of the house is very sort of reticent about describing the history of the house, and he's incredibly unpleasant to deal with. And they don't figure that out until they begin to realize that the house is haunted. And they figured this out very quickly. One of the things that I think is a clever conceit of this film is rather than dragging out the is it or isn't it haunting, almost the first night these people are in the house, they hear the sound of this weeping, wailing ghost, and they don't take very long to recognize that this is really happening. And so most of the movie isn't about discovering whether there is a ghost, it's about discovering why the ghost is there. And it's a wonderful, very old-fashioned, incredibly classic story. It's a family-friendly film, but also incredibly spooky. And the first time I ever saw it, I absolutely fell in love with it because it is just so brilliantly classic. And it has remained one of my every year at Halloween, I watch this film, even though it's it doesn't have a Halloween feel to it. It's not set in the autumn or anything like that, but it has that truly classic spookiness that I expect from a great ghost story. Now, are you familiar with this one?
You know what? I always thought that it had a very Wuthering Heights aspect to it.
It
The
really does.
whole
Yeah.
idea. It's that kind of atmosphere. It's very atmospheric. But yeah, again, I don't think there's any movies that you've picked so far or that I've picked that shouldn't be on the list. Not yet, at least. We'll have to talk about it as we go. But yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great representation of films for this time period to be on there.
I actually thought it was a fairly bold film in a lot of ways too, because in addition to throwing in a real ghost, which had become so uncommon that time, maybe because there are eras where people were less comfortable with the occult, they even have the main characters participate in a seance, which I'm sure was quite scandalizing to people. I don't know if anybody fainted in the theater over it, but something that was considered still a pretty terrifying idea. It dealt with marriage infidelity and a lot of very scandalous ideas.
Yes, yes, yes. A very modern film before its time.
It was, yeah.
Yeah. So my 1902, A Trip to the Moon, you are not going to fall asleep. This is about a 14-minute long a film based upon Jules Verne's Earth to the Moon. I do believe that's what it was, right? Yeah, Earth to the
It
Moon.
was indeed, yes.
Yeah. So this is really almost the first sci-fi movie. Whenever you see people looking at the moon and wanting to be the first people there, so they instead of a blasting off, they kind of fire a rocket that goes into this iconic image of going through the moon's eye, and they get out of the rocket without any kind of space gear on whatsoever, and they find out that there is actually creatures on the moon, and those creatures are called the Selenites, and they look remarkably like insects. And to go by progression, you could almost, if you squint, see an embryonic gray within that representation. So the
Huh.
reason why I put this movie in there is that this indeed may be the first time that an image of an alien was presented to us, and we continue with that image up into the present time. That this movie kind of informed us what was going on in outer space, and we latched on. And this image had these small things with big eyes have now become a part of our collective culture simply because of this film.
Interesting. Now, see, I haven't seen the film in so many years. I had forgotten about that. I'm actually have to try and see if I can track down some photos, or I'm sure there's plenty of copies of the film on YouTube. So I'll have to check that out because I never actually made that connection. But now I'm fascinated by that.
Yes.
So I'm going to have to check that out.
Yeah, I like, again, just kind of connecting the dots. But for the movie's not very good. I will tell you that. I mean, this is one of those that you could probably leave it off. But if you are going for the genesis of science fiction, you have to go here because this is about space travel and this is about aliens. And really, that's the reason why I put it on there. Not because it's an outstanding movie, but just simply because it meant so much to future generations.
And sometimes that's what's most important. It's not the quality of the film, but it's the impact that it has. Now, Ken was just saying that it was in 2002, I think he said on there, that
Yeah.
they actually discovered a print of the film in France, which in a barn in France, which I had not heard before. But you know what? That gives me hope for an eventual copy of London After Midnight showing up, which
Absolutely.
I'm still going to harp on. That's going to be my tagline going forward here. So at number six, again, you are down with the silent films these days, huh? The Lost World was silent, was it not?
It was. Oh, yeah.
It was, and another Jules Verne, isn't it? Or is that Arthur Conan Doyle?
This is Arthur Conan
Oh,
Doyle.
okay,
He
of
wrote
course,
the
of
book
course.
in 1911. So we're looking at one of these. That's a pretty quick turnaround for this particular time and place. We're looking at, 14 years, right? So
Mhm.
between the advent of the book to the motion picture. But yeah, The Lost World, again, it's the reason why I put it back to back from the Earth to the Moon. The reason I did that is kind of bookmarks, is you simply would not have the Lost World in Jurassic Park without this film. I mean, the second movie in the second book within that series is actually called The Lost World because of this. The idea that prehistoric animals could exist on an isolated plateau in South America is something that seems very current to us nowadays. The idea that these animals are living and there's kind of a stasis in evolution, and things are just kind of the same. Really does seem, again, like I said, it seems very modern to us. But watching this as a child, and we also have these 8-man representations in there, which look remarkably like what we would call Bigfoot to this very day. Just a really, you know what? I enjoyed this movie. I enjoyed the book as well. I enjoyed going with Professor Challenger on his quest to the Lost World and coming back again. That's all I have to say.
I wonder sometimes when I think about about Conan Doyle and Jules Verne, is that Jules Verne, of course, wrote about Scartaris, this world inside the Earth,
Yes.
which was partially populated by surviving prehistoric creatures. And I wonder maybe if Conan Doyle was partially inspired by him to with this idea. But that is something that, you're right, culturally has been such a huge impact, not just films, modern films like Jurassic Park, but this idea of a lost world populated by dinosaurs has turned up again and again and again in our fiction over the last century. One of
Yeah.
my favorite absolute favorite things as a child, and something that I still adore to this day, because it was such a brilliant work of science fiction and is often laughed off as just a bit of childish nonsense, was the television show, the kids television show, Land of the Lost.
Oh,
Land of
absolutely.
the Lost, about a family who basically falls into this other dimension populated by dinosaurs and these reptilian humanoid creatures. And one thing I think a lot of folks don't realize about this show, because it had a very cutesy family look to it, is that it was often, the scripts were written by some of the most well-known science fiction writers. We had William F. Nolan, I believe David Gerald may have contributed scripts to this. Some of the most well-known and established science fiction authors of our time actually committed scripts to Land of the Lost, which I think is remarkable when you think about it. It was very revolutionary science fiction for its time.
It was, and I actually have the collection on DVD, which I will still watch. Again, like you had said, the special effects doesn't stand up, but if you would just sit there and watch the story, it really does have a place in today's society.
It's not a dumbed down show for
It's
kids at
not.
all. I mean, it has some
No.
extraordinary science fiction conceits that they twisted my brain when I was a kid. I can
Oh,
tell you
me
that,
too.
you know.
Yeah.
So Irwin Allen wanted to use stop motion dinosaurs. Ken, you were just saying for this film, but he did due to the budget reasons he had to use lizards, mainly
That,
monitor
that,
lizards. Now
that
I
is,
remember this. Yeah, I remember
yeah,
this.
but that's for Journey to the Center of the Earth.
Yeah, that was for the later film, but
Yeah.
I remember actually that they had a chameleon that had a fin glued to his back
Yeah.
to portray a Dimetrodon in that. Because I was fascinated by Dimetrodons when I was a kid for some strange reason. Why is it that every kid picks one dinosaur that he falls in love with? I don't know
Just
what
falls in love with it.
that's
That's
all
right.
about.
That's right.
So my choice for this was had to go for a classic, which is of course 1931's original Frankenstein. Universal had recently had such great success with the film Dracula that they went right back to the classic monster pantheon and chose to make their version of Frankenstein. And we of course did a great episode on Frankenstein several weeks back, and talked extensively about this, but we couldn't go without having Frankenstein on this film. It's a film that is visually spectacular. It's done in a very German expressionist style, with a lot of strange angles and elaborate set work. The makeup on Boris Karloff as the creature is simply cadaverous, and he was already a fairly tall man, but they put him in those 6-inch boots, which made him just absolutely lumbering. And it's interesting because it was probably the only time that, and its follow-up Bride of Frankenstein, where for years and years, the only time that the monster was truly still portrayed as a fairly sympathetic creature, more or less in keeping with Mary Shelley's original book. And the monster is abandoned. The monster is abused by Fritz, the character who I think most people would probably think was named Igor and would become Igor in later films. But it will always, I think, remain one of the greatest horror films ever made, and therefore it has a big spot on this list. Now, it didn't make it into the top 5, and some people would probably find that strange, but part of that is because I think, like most of the very first Universal monster movies, it's slow paced, it has very little music, and that does make it hard from a modern perspective to be too thrilled by it, but it's still easy to really fall in love with the visual beauty of this film. And so I will always love it, even if it didn't make it into my top tier.
Absolutely.
So, following up on that, we've got some more good Universal coming right in here. So I'm going to start off with this one because we were just doing Frankenstein. We might as well talk about Dracula. Now, Dracula only gets to number 5 on this list, and most people who know me would say that seems nuts. I should have Dracula at number 1, and maybe there'll be a self-fulfilling prophecy in that. But the reason that I actually only put Dracula at number 5 on this list is that even though I truly love this film, I have to admit, and there's people out there who are going to scream blasphemy, Bela Lugosi's Dracula, directed by Todd Browning, isn't a particularly good movie. What it is, however, is a remarkably iconic and influential movie. The set design is truly gorgeous. The costume work is beautiful. The matte paintings, everything about it is a joy to watch visually. but there are some terrible, terrible choices made in this film. A lot of people, I think, just because he is so iconic, tend to talk about the amazing performance that Bela Lugosi gives as Dracula in this film. But the truth is that it really isn't an excellent performance. Bela Lugosi's strange delivery, which people find so odd and curious, wasn't a choice. It was that he barely spoke English and he had to learn almost all of his lines phonetically. So when he says, "I am Dracula," he didn't even know a different way to say it. His strange halting delivery. So no shame to Bela Lugosi, a man who was barely spoke the language and still took on a leading role, speaking part from a language he didn't speak. That's a remarkable accomplishment. But it's not a phenomenal performance from him. And the movie certainly suffers more than anything else from being based much less on Bram Stoker's novel than it is on the stage play that was running at that time. And they took the expansive, globe-trotting story of Bram Stoker's novel Dracula and turned it mostly into a polite English drawing room drama. And it's a dull film. It's very, talk about a movie you fall asleep during. It's a movie that's actually a talkie and still can be very, very boring. So I know there's people out there, again, who are going to cry foul on that one. But as a huge Dracula fan, and I believe something of a Dracula scholar, I'm going to say that it is not one of the finest Dracula films, despite its truly extraordinary impact on the image of Dracula. Our vision of who Dracula is, how Dracula looks, so much of that comes from this film, which is remarkable for a movie that is really a fairly tepid experience. But it's made enough of an impact that it deserves its place at in the center of my top 10 here.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. The reason why I did not include it on my top 10 list, spoiler,
and I didn't miss that point, by the way.
yeah,
I
that's
saw
right,
that
is simply because of the casting. And I do understand this was in 1931, but all the characters that were supposed to be, kind of hovering around the age of 20, all appear to be in their late 40s, early 50s. And it seems, as you said, it seems as if I'm watching a parlor play at one of the local, dinner theaters down the road.
exactly.
But it is, as you said, again, stunning to look at, and definitely it's setting the stage for the upcoming monster movies.
It is
The ones.
indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. So Boris Karloff, again, we had talked about the Mummy, so on a previous show. So I thought we'll have to include the Mummy on this one as well too. It is a frightening, not one of those things where there's not a lot of jump scares or anything. The main character moves around quite slowly, but again, this is about 7 years after Howard Carter excavated King Tut's tomb. Egyptology and all these ancient wonders of the world is now in the public's imagination. And what better way to bring that even closer to the public than by making a monster out of it? And so I included in there because I do think that this is a phenomenal performance, by the way. I think everybody did a very good job on this. Again, it is atmospheric, but it just sets the stage, again, for the future that's going to happen within this particular genre.
And I actually think it's a very visually impressive film too. It's got a beautiful look to it. The lighting, as you can see, just in this one, even this one single shot, lighting was beautifully done. The makeup was extraordinary. And so, again, a lot of these earlier films were fairly slow moving, but visually it was always a feast for the eyes.
Absolutely.
So at number 4 on our list, you chose Frankenstein. So, hopefully not stealing your thunder, but let's hear your perspective on there.
No, again, this was a great book, right? And this, but if you would read the book, and I hope a lot of our listeners have read the book, this is a reimagining of it in that particular culture in the 1930s, which I found remarkable. We do have the idea of electricity being involved. We have the idea of mankind being able to create something that can have devastating aspects on the world around them unintentionally, just like war that was already blazing across Europe. We're now going into the Second World War in 1931. So I think it's in its particular time and place. If we were to project ourselves onto the Frankenstein's monster, we see a lot of ourselves in that. We see what we're capable of doing, which is amazing things, but a lot of the things that we do also even if it's unintentional, is to bring a great deal of ruin to the world as well. So that's the reason I chose Frankenstein.
Absolutely. Now, I want to point out, Jeff chimed in a minute ago and said that when he was young, that they had a projector, and I think he said his dad or one of his family members, right, had gotten a copy of one of the old Universal horror movies on. I think probably it's the 8 millimeter Castle films that had these little short versions of it. And I got to tell you, Jeff, I am right there with you. A little bit later on, when we get farther down the list, I had a very similar experience with another Universal film, and it started me on this road. I have to tell you, it's the first monster movie I ever saw, and I absolutely fell in love. It was one of those quick little cuts of one of these movies, and to this day, I've been seeking to get a copy of that old Castle film and an old projector and just sit there and enjoy that old experience. So for my fourth film on this list, again, I chose 1931's Dracula, all filmed on those same sets, but with an entirely separate set of actors. And for those of you who don't realize that back then, it was less expensive to reshoot a film with foreign-speaking actors than it was to dub a film into a foreign language. And since there was a fairly large Spanish-speaking market, Carlos Villeros and Lupita Tovar took the roles of Dracula and Mina respectively in the Spanish version of Dracula, filmed simultaneously with the Bela Lugosi version. But, and this is where it gets interesting, this is a far superior film to the Lugosi version for a lot of reasons. One, because the Spanish-speaking of the Spanish actors, being of Mediterranean blood, had a more passionate, a more sort of erotic presentation, because the film had to be shot at night because they weren't able to use the sets during the day. And so it is visually much more impressive than the Lugosi film. They used different special effects. They had different physical, sort of a physical presentation. And it's a richer film. It's a more visually sumptuous film. And even the performances, even reading subtitles with it dubbed, because I don't speak a word of Spanish, conveys so much more emotion. And to me, it's the superior version of the 1931 Dracula. And again, sorry, Bela, you're a great man, but I'm going to take the Spanish version of that one every time.
And I've never seen this movie.
If you have a chance, I think you'll agree with me, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that if you ever get a chance to see it.
I will. But before next Monday, I'm going to look it up on YouTube and see if I can find it someplace.
You should definitely do that. So at number 3, we're cruising towards the end here. At number 3, it looks like we have some synchronicity because Ron and I both picked one movie, and this would be 1941's glorious The Wolfman, the film that turned Lon Chaney Jr. into a world-renowned star and gave him the nickname the Man of One Face. This, of course, is the story of Lawrence Talbot, a young American of British birth, who, after spending most of his adolescent and young adult years away in America, comes back to Wales, where his brother has recently been killed in a hunting accident. And when he comes back to see his father, a fairly strained relationship, ends up running afoul of a gypsy cursed by the werewolf curse and inherits the curse himself. And this is the film that for really the next 100 years, well, the next 80 plus years, would redefine the werewolf folklore for generations to come. This is the werewolf movie. The Universal had taken one crack at it earlier with a film called The Werewolf of London, which kind of suffered from what I would call the Dracula curse, in that it was a far too polite movie. This, in one case, I used to have fits of hysterics when I watched The Werewolf of London, because the werewolf would go through his transformation, his face would get furry, he'd grow his fangs, then he'd grab his scarf, wrap his scarf around his neck, put on his flat cap, and head out for a lovely evening on the town. It was one of the most polite werewolves you've ever seen. So I would have to say that I'm going to always pick Lon Chaney on this one, who, while maybe not a particularly emotive actor, brought a lot of savagery to Lawrence Talbot's Wolfman. And he may not have been very interesting as Mr. Talbot, but as the Wolfman, he was a very impressive specimen.
Yes. And I think he played it as a typical American as well, too. I'm not sure if the director told him to, or if that was the
kind of a lug. He was definitely kind of a lug.
Exactly. Right. He came off as this typical American guy that, he's eating hot dogs someplace, drinking a beer, and talking about how poor the culture is over there.
I have to tell you, one of my favorite things in the world is to actually apologize, I'm jumping ahead here, is to imitate Larry Talbot, because for I think he was in about 6 films as Lawrence Talbot, and by the end you always knew he was going to show up on screen and he would say, "Oh, don't you see? When that moon rises, I'm going to change into a wolf and I'm going to eat somebody. I just want someone to kill me." And he would just say this every film, time and time again, get shot by a silver bullet at the end, and then somehow somebody would end up resurrecting him at the end of the next film. And that poor guy, as I say, stuck with a role for the rest of his mortal life.
That's right. That's right.
A wonderful film. It's the one that brought us the legend of the silver bullet as a way to kill a werewolf. It brought us the full moon. Well, later incarnations of Larry Talbot actually made the moon full. It was just the moon in the original film. The pentagram being associated with the werewolf. Really, Kurt Siodmak, the screenwriter for this film, almost single-handedly created an entirely new folklore, which would follow the werewolf really forward right up to this day.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So we're cruising right into the last 2 films here, and I think we can just about make it today. So tell us about your choice, Ron.
Well, King Kong. You can't go wrong with King Kong. I cannot believe that other people do not have King Kong on their list. So this was Ray Harryhausen, correct? This was
indeed
awesome stop motion effects, to the point that whenever King Kong fights these dinosaurs, especially the T-Rex, you can actually see Ray Harryhausen's thumbprint on the hair as they stop motioning it through there. Look, this scared me as a kid. I live outside of Pittsburgh. Every Thanksgiving on WOR out of New York City, they would have a King Kong marathon on. So it would start off with King Kong, then it would go to the Son of Kong, and then it would go to, of all things, oh gosh, I forget about it. The other big monkey movie. What was that called?
Mighty Joe Young?
Mighty Joe Young, which doesn't really play, but in this. But King Kong, look, we have dinosaurs. We have, the damsel in distress. And this is really a precursor to all the other things that was going to be happening as well. And if the rumor is true or not, this was also claimed to be Adolf Hitler's favorite movie. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I had never heard that. That's definitely kind of a curiosity. Now, I do have to say, I'm right there with you. And I think the only reason I didn't put Kong on my list is because, again, I kind of put it more in the sci-fi film more than a horror movie to me. And although certainly Kong is definitely a monster and absolutely qualifies, I was kind of leaning more towards the horror than that. But it was a movie that I absolutely adored when I was a kid. So wait a minute, what's Ken saying here? You'll have the tallest, darkest leading man in Hollywood. That's great. I had never heard that. I thought that was fantastic. But I absolutely adored Kong as a kid, and I was right there first in line in 1976 when the remake of Kong came out, and right there when Peter Jackson's Kong came out. And I still will always love King Kong till the day I die.
Absolutely. And I think I may have misspoke because somebody on here corrected me. Superman. They said that this was the kind of the Ray Harryhausen didn't do this, but this is what got him into the film industry. I do believe that probably is true. I think this might be a little bit earlier.
And I actually think you're right on that. And John is certainly he's a nerd with the best of us, and so I trust him on this one. And I actually believe I read an interview with Harryhausen where he was saying that this was the film that inspired him. So thank you for jumping on that. You know what? We have to, sometimes we need to be kept in our lane as well, John. So thank you for that.
They're intrinsically tied together, though. Let's put it that way.
They very much are. So I'm going to blast through this one because we only have a few minutes left here. But Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, that was the one, Jeff, that I got to watch at. We had a local wildlife sanctuary that had a huge Halloween party every year, and they ran Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman on that Castle Films 8mm. And this film, I'm here today because of that film. I was so fascinated. It had all the highlights of the movie, the spooky graveyard opening, and of course the climactic battle between Frankenstein, one of my absolute favorite monsters, and the Wolfman, whom I've always loved. And I'd never seen anything like it. And so even though this film features Bela Lugosi in a very, very ill-fitting role as the Frankenstein monster, for me, it did not matter. It was just pure monster mash gold. And ever since then, these monster mashup movies have been my absolute heart and soul. But we've got to get to number one, and so let's do it. So once again, synchronicity won out, and Ron and I both chose probably what the first and greatest monster movie ever made. Still phenomenal. 100 years later, 1922, W.F. Murnau's classic Nosferatu, the very first, we believe, certainly the first surviving film adaptation of Dracula, a film which was adapted from Dracula, but which was not given copyright release. And so, to the great appreciation of the entire world over, although every copy of this film was ordered to be destroyed by Florence Stoker's widow, who sued the production company and won in court, a few prints of this film survived, and it remains one of the creepiest, most beautifully made vampire films ever made, horror films ever made, again with incredible German expressionism in its visuals, beautiful special effects, as you can see right here. Max Schreck, a man whose name in German meant fear, which is remarkable, and that was not a stage name, that was his real name. The makeup on him is incredible, and it was a comparatively faithful adaptation of Dracula, just had the name switched. And to this day, 100 years later, congratulations, Nosferatu, still, I think, probably the greatest vampire film really ever made.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. And even though they did not get the copyrights, there's so much, especially early in the film, that plays to the book that other movies have never had before. For instance, whenever the Dracula steals the baby to feed to his brides, in the book you have the mother come looking for the child, and that's never portrayed. But in this film, it is, and it's starkly dramatic the way it's done. It's actually very off-putting, you know.
They used, strange film imagery, reversing. They actually painted a horse and carriage white and then filmed everything in reverse so that the horse and carriage would look black on film, but they could make the day turn into night. I mean, all these remarkable visual trips that they did. And yes, John, by the way, I remember when you told me that the filmmakers for the Nosferatu series, based on what Joe Hill's series, actually scouted out your house for a location for that film, which is what I actually seen the first season of Nosferatu, and that is a freaky and creepy little show in and of itself. But guys, we are right here at 9:02. We've gone just a wee bit over, but I want to thank you as always for joining us tonight. And we had to zip right on through this, but it was great fun.
I had a blast.
You know, and it is fun sometimes to go for a lighter approach too. This was one where we just got to be complete geeks on this. And thank you guys all for sticking with us for a couple of extra minutes over. We will be back, of course, as always, next Monday with hopefully a new fun topic. We haven't chosen for that yet. We always do this by the seat of our pants. But as always, folks, like and subscribe if you get a chance. Check out Ron Murphy on Amazon.com. You can check out my books, ghostboypress.com. And absolutely thrilled to have you here with us every week. And we will see you guys in 7 days. See if I can get up our outro.